Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the abstract factory pattern, and I really thought this pattern was super interesting, even the factory method pattern, because I've just created objects within my own programs, applications, and I wasn't really sure why you want to have these classes that are only meant to encapsulate the object creation. And so once I started to do more research on both this pattern and the factory method pattern, a lot of things kind of came up, which I'll talk about through this demo and through this video. But basically, for the abstract factory pattern, a big part of this pattern deals a lot with grouping families of objects together. And so, a big use case for this pattern is when you have something like maybe a toolkit or a theme that has a lot of similar objects or not similar, you have these objects that you want to have together in one theme or one toolkit, but you have different themes or different toolkits that change those specific objects themselves. If that doesn't make a lot of sense, I'm going to kind of go through and highlight, and hopefully I can explain a little bit more of those nuances and details. Okay, so we're just going to look at this demo, and just to give you a little bit more details on this demo, this is we're just pretending that this is going to create some theme for the window, which is this screen. And so we can just see the theme up here, and the themes that we have basically are text and image. And just so you know, I added some detail. So if there's no theme, you can't click on these different buttons. And with the themes themselves, we can add on these objects like a navigation, a window, and content. And so before we can add content, we have to add the window, then we can add the content, and then we can add the navigation. And then we can reset it, and then it clears up everything. Now, the good thing about this demo is we can kind of mix and match the content as well. So this is kind of what it looks like if we just added the window, the content, the navigation. But what if we wanted to add the text window, add the image content, and then add the text navigation? We could do that as well. And so I just wanted to add a little bit of complexity so you can play around with it yourself. And what's nice is the actions are highlighted here, so it can kind of help make sense on when you click which button for which purpose. And so the biggest takeaway you want to know from this front end is just understanding that there are themes with different objects that change accordingly. So let's just dive into the code. And so when we're looking at this code, we want to focus a bit on the interface that generates the themes themselves, because that's the abstract factory itself. So a lot of the concrete instantiation of the factory comes from the abstract factory. So we have these navigation, window, and content, and every theme, which is here, implements that interface and will generate its own class of objects that follow that theme. That's important because now for this example, I've also had those objects themselves have their own interface that has a display function that's called. And that's important because when we kind of separate the object instantiation through its own class, we're able to modify the way that these objects are created. Maybe for your use case for your application or software, maybe you have more complexity of logic that indicates that if something is created, some object needs to be created, or some tool or some theme or some specific item needs to be created under some unique circumstance, while some other circumstance dictates some other object needs to be created. And when you have these objects being created in their own unique factory, I've come to understand that you actually are able to focus on that factory itself and not having to go through every single individual method that when that factory is created, you're decoupling the relationship a bit by having those objects in its own unique factory. So every time that they're created, you don't have to focus on the function where it's being created, but anytime you need to add some bit of complexity in that creation of the object, you can go to the factory itself. Another thing that I've come to realize too, just listening to a lot of podcasts, listening to clean code, being influenced a lot on just trying to clean up my own code, is you can kind of see in examples. So first we know that the factories, there's always going to be one factory that creates those objects. But when we see when they're being created here as well, it's interesting to see this single line code because it kind of makes our code a bit more readable in that way that instead of having more code that's I create the code, I have to return this, I have to do that, this single line demonstrates and explains exactly what's happening when this function is being called, which this function is being called as this button is being pressed. So through this pattern and through these factories, we are in a way simplifying the way that this code is not being done, because in a way it's not, we can't simplify the complexity. This code already has a set logic that's being in place, but in terms of being able to read this logic and being able to understand what's going on, when we have this specific way of creating these patterns and using these patterns, we're able to, in a way, understand how these functions are being called and how they're being used. And like I said before, if we were in any way needing to, let's say, change this display for this window or change this window on this theme, since we have put those, the call to instantiate that object or that call for that function in their own independent classes or through their own independent concrete implementation of that abstract interface, we can go directly to that class, the concrete class that we have, that method, and we can adjust it accordingly. And in that way, we can kind of fix maybe some things with maintenance, and we can handle problems when our code gets way bigger and a little bit more complex, since we have those very well-defined places where we create the object, where we have that function being called, and it's less of a muddled mixture of logic and things like that when we know exactly where we might have a problem, because this code is a little bit, it's not complex, but it's a little bit long and it has many different parts to it. But if any issue came up through our compiler or through our code or through wherever, we can maybe directly understand the specific place that the code or logic is being is not fulfilling its purpose. Like, we can understand through this separation of object creation, of the function being called, of another function calling these functions, maybe through this set content, if there was issue here, I would know exactly, oh, it's the conditional here. If it's not displaying correctly, I could understand it's here. And through this, through maybe the object isn't the right object itself, so I can kind of separate and split that because it's being directly disconnected from each other as well. So yeah, this demo is a little bit short, a little bit straightforward, I think. A big part of using this pattern is, again, just to strictly group some objects together that you know you're going to modify. And a lot of times the example is like a theme. And a good purpose for this pattern as well is just having that separation, being able to increase your ability to kind of like isolate some problem, scale things out. That's a big reason why we isolate those responsibilities. Going back to the single responsibility principle, like we have a class that's specifically to instantiate the object, and those objects themselves have some specific function that that they only follow. So if we know that to be true, then we're able to add on more complexity and isolate any changes to our logic or to our code or to our complexity of our application that we need to that specific class or object or function. And we won't have to modify or adjust any other part of the code because we have completely isolated and abstracted those objects themselves. And so I hope that made sense. If not, definitely go through. I'll provide a link in the description. You can go through the code, you can kind of play around with it, and just look a little bit deeper into how that the code is written, and kind of in a way you can play around with the code as well. So I hope that was helpful, and until next time, I'll see you guys.